The morning had barely begun when I noticed the messages flooding my phone. Vacation photos, selfies on pristine beaches, and captions full of laughter were everywhere. But as I scrolled through them, a sinking feeling gripped my chest. These weren't just pictures of any family trip. They were of my sister, sunbathing on the deck of a luxurious resort, my parents smiling beside her, champagne flutes in hand. And there I was, not in the frame, not invited, not even informed. I felt invisible, humiliated, and utterly betrayed. How could they plan an extravagant vacation for her and not even mention it to me? I had always been the quiet one, the child who followed rules, the one who didn't make waves. Yet I had never imagined I would be so deliberately excluded. The betrayal stung, but the humiliation cut deeper. I remembered all the birthdays, anniversaries, and small victories I had quietly celebrated alone, while my sister's accomplishments were announced with fanfare. This wasn't just a vacation. They had chosen to elevate her while erasing me. The contrast was almost too sharp to bear, her laughter echoing through my phone screen while I sat in a small, quiet apartment, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. Every picture reminded me of their favoritism, of a family hierarchy I had reluctantly accepted but had never fully confronted. And yet, amid the anger and hurt, there was a flicker of something else. An instinctive awareness that the story wasn't over, that perhaps I had a power they were yet to comprehend. I tried to breathe, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an oversight, I told myself. Perhaps they thought I was too busy, or maybe they assumed I wouldn't enjoy such a lavish trip. But deep down, I knew better. This was a pattern, not a mistake. From childhood, subtle exclusions had marked my life. Forgotten mentions during family gatherings, slight dismissals during holidays, and whispered compliments reserved for my sister. She was the golden child, the center of attention, and I had learned to endure the shadow she cast. Yet, for the first time, the shadow felt suffocating. The sense of injustice ignited a fire in me I hadn't recognized before. Scrolling through their posts, I noticed the little details they probably thought I wouldn't see. The concierge greeting my sister by name, the suite with a private balcony, the gourmet meals ordered with care. Each detail was a slap to my pride, a deliberate reminder of my exclusion. But as humiliation gnawed at me, my mind began to shift. Anger morphed into calculation. There had to be a way to balance the scales, to turn this narrative of shame into one of empowerment. I wasn't powerless. I just needed the right moment to reveal it. A seed of a plan started forming, quiet at first, but gaining strength with every image I absorbed. The contrast between my sister's privileges and my own exclusion became almost tangible. She, adorned in luxury, unaware of the silent storm brewing far away, and me, isolated yet observing, beginning to see patterns and opportunities hidden within my family's arrogance. It was ironic. My exclusion had inadvertently given me perspective. Where they flaunted their carelessness, I began to see leverage. Where they underestimated me, I glimpsed potential. The humiliation I felt could either crush me or serve as a catalyst, and for the first time, I understood that the choice was mine. The story of exclusion was not the ending. It was the opening of a narrative they couldn't predict. I reflected on the subtle power dynamics that had defined my family for years. My parents, well-meaning in their minds but blind to the emotional consequences of favoritism. My sister, charming, entitled, yet oblivious to the way her privileges affected me. And I, quiet, often overlooked, but capable of calculating moves that no one anticipated. That realization gave me a strange comfort. If they believed my absence diminished me, they were gravely mistaken. Their failure to include me had done the opposite. It had given me clarity and an unexpected edge. The morning's images, meant to mock my exclusion, became a blueprint for the story I was about to write in return. As I continued to study the photos, I remembered past family vacations and events, moments that had reinforced the hierarchy, the overlooked birthdays, the empty chairs at important dinners, the way my suggestions were dismissed. Each memory had contributed to a reservoir of suppressed frustration and cunning. That reservoir was swelling now, fueled by betrayal and the raw emotional sting of being left out. And yet, there was also a cautious excitement, the kind that comes when you realize the opportunity for reversal is within your grasp. I wasn't just a passive victim of favoritism. I was about to become a silent architect of change. The contrast framing was stark, almost cinematic in its intensity. My sister, bathed in the sun of privilege, unaware of the storm gathering in her absence. And me, in quiet reflection, preparing to step out of the shadows with intent and precision. Every laugh, every perfectly staged photograph of their joy became a counterpoint to the hidden strength I was cultivating. I imagined the moment when the power dynamics would shift, when those who had underestimated me would finally see the depth of my agency. It was thrilling and terrifying, the kind of emotional tension that grips you because it feels both inevitable and unpredictable. Even in the midst of anger, I couldn't help but analyze the situation with careful detail. Their oversight, deliberate or not, had revealed weaknesses I could exploit. The hotel, the staff, the family's overconfidence, their underestimation of me, each became a piece of the puzzle. I started to sketch scenarios in my mind, imagining the shock on their faces when reality overturned their assumptions. The humiliation they had planned for me could easily be redirected toward them. And that thought, of hidden power finally coming to the surface, sparked a perverse kind of satisfaction. The audience, I realized, would immediately resonate with that tension, the shift from helplessness to subtle, inevitable empowerment. By the time the morning sun had fully risen, the emotional landscape had transformed. What began as shock and betrayal evolved into clarity and anticipation. I knew the family dynamics would never be the same. This section of the story had to end with a reflection that bridges seamlessly into the background, the history of favoritism, the small but significant slights, the patterns that made this exclusion predictable. That reflection would set the stage for the audience to understand not just the event, but the emotional depth and psychological stakes of the protagonist's journey. The stage was set, the tension high, and the twist, as yet unseen, was waiting just over the horizon. The moment I sat down to process the morning's discovery, my mind drifted to the people who had made this exclusion possible. My parents and my sister. My father, a man who prided himself on success and status, had always treated my sister as the golden child, the one whose achievements reflected well on the family. My mother, gentle but indulgent, seemed to operate under an unspoken hierarchy that placed my sister above me in every meaningful way. It wasn't always overt. There were no harsh words, no blatant favoritism. But the small, almost imperceptible gestures told their story. A louder cheer for my sister's accomplishments, a quicker response to her needs, a subtle dismissal of mine. Growing up in this environment had taught me patience, resilience, and the quiet art of observation. My sister, radiant and self-assured, had a way of drawing attention effortlessly. Every room she entered seemed to bend toward her energy. She was the kind of person who could smile and have everyone laugh, who could charm teachers, family friends, and even complete strangers. I admired her, of course, I still do, but I couldn't ignore the sting of comparison. Her privileges were many, and mine were few, and it was clear from a young age that the scales of affection and approval tilted heavily in her favor. Birthdays, school achievements, even weekend outings. Everything seemed to underscore the unspoken message. She was first, I was second, or sometimes, not even considered. I remembered a summer long ago when our parents had planned a weekend getaway for all three of us, or so I thought. The truth was, my sister's friends were invited, the excursions meticulously organized for her enjoyment. while I was left to tag along quietly, overlooked and unnoticed. I had begged to participate in activities, offered to help plan, tried to insert myself into conversations, yet my contributions were brushed aside. My parents' eyes always seemed to sparkle more brightly for her laughter than mine. It wasn't malicious. They genuinely loved me. But the pattern of exclusion, repeated over and over, left an invisible mark that had grown heavier with each passing year. Those small humiliations, subtle as they were, had shaped me in ways I didn't fully understand until now. I had learned to speak softly, to avoid drawing attention, to anticipate the needs of others before my own. And while these traits were quietly admired by teachers and distant relatives, within my own family, they often went unrecognized. I became the silent witness to my sister's triumphs, the one who cheered from the sidelines, whose achievements were quietly acknowledged but never celebrated. This upbringing had forged patience and strategic thinking, but it had also seeded resentment, a longing for recognition that never arrived. As I reflected on my parents, I realized how much their values shaped the family dynamics. My father measured success in external markers, wealth, prestige, social acknowledgement, while my mother measured it in compliance and harmony. Together they created a world where my sister thrived effortlessly, her charm amplified by their approval, while I navigated the margins, learning to observe, calculate, and endure. The pattern was clear. My sister was celebrated, and I was noted only when convenient. I had come to accept this hierarchy, believing that someday, perhaps, my own accomplishments would speak for themselves. Yet beneath the acceptance was a simmering awareness of my own abilities. I had ambitions, skills, and a quiet tenacity that no one in the family fully appreciated. I excelled in ways that didn't immediately draw attention, but held significant power. Understanding people, noticing small details, and leveraging knowledge others overlooked. It was a subtle, invisible strength, one I had cultivated silently. And as I processed the morning's betrayal, I recognized that this strength, long dormant in my family's eyes, could become my secret weapon. The exclusion that had humiliated me could now serve as a catalyst for transformation. The sibling dynamic was equally layered. My sister had grown accustomed to being prioritized, sometimes oblivious to the privilege she enjoyed. She had never intentionally excluded me, at least not with malice, but she operated within the same invisible hierarchy my parents had set. Her assumptions about my presence, or absence, reflected her own upbringing, where attention and affection were doled out unevenly, yet naturally. The contrast between her life of privileges and my existence on the sidelines was stark. This morning's revelation, however, reframed that contrast entirely. For the first time, I saw that the power imbalance could be disrupted, that the family's assumptions about my passivity were dangerously short-sighted. I thought back to family gatherings, where my contributions were minimized and my sister's opinions amplified. At dinner parties, she would share stories that captivated everyone, while my anecdotes were met with polite nods or quick changes in topic. At holidays, she received the first slice of dessert, the choice seating, the spotlight that illuminated her presence. I had learned to accommodate, to observe, to smile graciously while feeling invisible. But this morning, as images of their vacation flooded my phone, the accumulation of years of quiet exclusion crystallized into acute awareness. This pattern of favoritism was predictable, and it could be leveraged. The emotional weight of these memories mingled with a growing determination. The initial sting of humiliation began to evolve into strategic clarity. I realized that my family's oversight, their casual, unthinking prioritization of my sister, was not just an affront, it was an opportunity. Every unchecked assumption, every moment of underestimation, created openings for me to assert influence in ways they would never anticipate. For years, they had assumed my compliance was weakness. Now I recognized it as patience, observation, and the foundation of a coming reversal. As the morning progressed, I considered the logistics of the trip. Where had they gone? How had they arranged it without informing me? Which hotel? Which staff? Which suite? The curiosity mixed with indignation, fueling my resolve. I imagined walking into that resort, not as the forgotten sibling, but as someone with agency, leverage, and authority. The contrast between exclusion and potential empowerment became vivid in my mind. Their laughter, carefreeness, and blind confidence would eventually collide with my own calculated presence. This was the moment where humiliation could transform into opportunity, where my quiet power could assert itself. I recalled subtle childhood victories, moments where my capabilities had gone unnoticed by family but were acknowledged elsewhere. Academic achievements, small acts of cleverness, moments where I had quietly influenced outcomes, they were all evidence that the skills needed to shift this narrative existed. The morning's betrayal wasn't just painful, it was illuminating. I began to mentally chart the possibilities, imagining scenarios where the family would be confronted with truths they had never considered. The contrast between their expectation of passivity and the reality of my agency was intoxicating. The emotional tone was complex. Frustration, helplessness, and yearning intertwined with a nascent thrill of potential. Each memory of exclusion, each subtle slight, was reframed as a building block for empowerment. The narrative momentum grew naturally toward action. The images on my phone, meant to provoke shame, now became a lens through which I understood the gaps in their assumptions. I could see the vulnerabilities, the overconfidence, and the blind spots that would allow me to assert myself in ways that would shock them. The moment I opened the text, my heart sank as if someone had plunged a knife into it. My parents had sent a photo album to the family group chat, a glossy collection of sunlit beaches, extravagant cocktails, and my sister laughing with her arms thrown wide, free and unburdened. But there was no mention of me, not a single snapshot, not a line of text, not even a "wish you were here." The deliberate exclusion hit me like a wave. Disbelief swept over me first, like a fog I couldn't shake. Had they truly done this? My parents, the ones who had always taught me that family comes first, had planned a lavish vacation without even telling me. The humiliation was immediate and piercing. I scrolled through the photos, trying to find some clue, some subtle hint that maybe I had been forgotten by accident. But every image screamed intentionality. My sister lounging on a private balcony, a mountain of designer luggage beside her. My parents toasting each other as if the occasion was solely theirs to enjoy. Even the hotel staff, polite and attentive in every photo, had unknowingly become part of the silent betrayal. I felt invisible, erased from a reality that should have included me. The contrast between their joy and my absence was blinding. Anger bubbled beneath the initial shock. How could they treat me this way? I remembered birthdays when my requests for attention had been brushed aside, times I had spoken up only to be silenced by polite nods, and subtle reminders that my sister's happiness mattered more than mine. The exclusion wasn't just hurtful. It was the culmination of a lifetime of small humiliations, a pattern now laid bare in a cruel, sunny paradise. I felt a flush of injustice, but beneath it, a strange awareness began to take hold. I had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. But perhaps this oversight could become my advantage. As the morning wore on, I felt my emotions oscillate between disbelief and self-doubt. Was I overreacting? Did I misinterpret their intentions? The rational part of my mind tried to soothe the sting, but the gut knew the truth. This wasn't a mistake. It was a reflection of the family hierarchy that had been cemented over years. My sister first, I second, or not even considered. My parents, whether consciously or unconsciously, had always favored her. And now, in the glaring clarity of vacation photos, the invisible pattern had been broadcast for all to see. The contrast was unbearable. My sister's laughter, captured in glossy digital perfection, echoed through my phone like a cruel refrain. Her joy was tangible. Mine was invisible. I had always accepted my role in this family, but the image of her soaking in attention, luxury, and love while I was absent crystallized something in me. My exclusion was not an endpoint, but a provocation. Anger sharpened into awareness, and awareness into strategy. I realized that humiliation could be transformed into a force, that invisibility could become a source of power. I remembered the vacations we had taken together as children, or, more accurately, the vacations I had taken as the silent companion. While my sister's whims were catered to, my comfort was considered secondary. I had learned early to negotiate invisibility, to play the background role, and to observe every interaction with a careful eye. And now, that skill of observation, long honed in quiet resentment, became invaluable. I began to catalog every detail of the vacation from afar: the hotel's name, the staff, the apparent luxuries. Each data point was a potential tool for the moment I would reclaim agency. Disbelief gave way to a flicker of dark amusement. If my parents thought excluding me would diminish me, they had miscalculated. My sister's carefree laughter was a challenge, a dare almost. The images became fuel for a mental storyboard, how each move of mine could disrupt the assumptions they had made about my passivity. For the first time in years, the humiliation was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a plan that only I could execute. Every detail they flaunted became a leverage point I could exploit, a reversal waiting to unfold. Doubt lingered, of course. Could I confront them? Would they take me seriously if I tried to assert myself? But then, a quiet certainty emerged. Their behavior had revealed predictable weaknesses: overconfidence, blind indulgence of my sister, underestimation of my resolve. Where they had assumed obedience, I found opportunity. Where they had assumed meekness, I found agency. The emotional impact of the exclusion had sharpened my perception, forcing me to see the patterns I had once ignored. As I continued to process the situation, my mind oscillated between humiliation and empowerment. I pictured the family's reaction if I walked into their vacation unannounced, if I made my presence impossible to ignore. The very images meant to taunt me could be reframed into a dramatic reversal. Contrast framing became the lens through which I imagined the scene. Their laughter frozen, my calm assertion of authority, the sudden acknowledgement of a power they had long overlooked. The humiliation they had engineered for me could, in an instant, become their own. The emotional weight of the inciting incident set the stage for rising conflict. I wasn't just angry. I was calculating. I wasn't just hurt. I was observing. Every slight, every image, every indication of favoritism was a piece of the narrative I would reconstruct to my advantage. The betrayal had forced me out of complacency, awakening a strategic mind that had been dormant. And as the day progressed, I made a decision. This exclusion would not stand. I would respond, but with precision, leveraging every detail I had at my disposal. The morning faded into afternoon, but the intensity of my emotional storm did not. Disbelief, anger, humiliation, all converged with clarity, focus, and a growing sense of purpose. I drafted mental scenarios, weighing reactions, predicting weaknesses, and imagining a dramatic reversal that would leave them speechless. The inciting incident had accomplished more than humiliation. It had revealed the path forward, the cracks in their assumptions, and the opportunities for assertion of power. The stage was now set for the rising conflict, and I could feel the anticipation building like an electric charge in my chest. By evening, I was no longer simply a passive observer of my own exclusion. The betrayal had sharpened every instinct, every insight I had accumulated over years of subtle humiliation. I understood my family's dynamics in a way I never had before. Their indulgence of my sister, their assumptions of my passivity, their casual overconfidence, all of it would be leveraged when the time came. The inciting incident was complete. The exclusion had been revealed, the humiliation endured, and the strategy forming. The tension was ripe, the narrative poised to escalate. In the days that followed, the weight of exclusion settled like a shadow over every interaction with my family. At dinner, my parents laughed over stories from the vacation, describing the beach, the suite, the staff, as if I had never existed. My sister's joy radiated across the table, a living reminder of the gulf between her privileges and my invisibility. Microaggressions, once subtle, now pierced with precision. "I know you're busy," my father said when I mentioned wanting to join them, as though my presence were a burden. The contrast between their carefree confidence and my simmering awareness became nearly unbearable. I realized the rising conflict was not only external, but internal. The humiliation gnawed at me, yet my mind was alive with calculation. Every word, every glance, every interaction was now filtered through a lens of strategy. I observed patterns: my parents' overindulgence of my sister, the staff's unquestioning service, my sister's oblivion to my feelings. These observations became tools, allowing me to anticipate their next moves and prepare my own. Where they saw compliance, I saw opportunity. Where they assumed weakness, I found leverage. At family gatherings, the tension became tangible. My sister recounted adventures from the vacation, detailing every luxury, every indulgence, every moment of attention from our parents. I listened, outwardly composed, inwardly simmering with both humiliation and emerging power. Each story, though intended to flaunt superiority, only sharpened my awareness of the very cracks I could exploit. I began to see that their very confidence, the casual arrogance with which they assumed my passivity, was the perfect breeding ground for a reversal. Conversations became tests of patience and perception. My parents, blissfully unaware, revealed their assumptions about me in casual remarks. "You wouldn't enjoy something like that," they said, or "it's just easier this way." Each comment reinforced the pattern of underestimation, confirming that the family's confidence in my inaction was their blind spot. The humiliation and subtle dismissals fueled a quiet fire, transforming embarrassment into resolve. I could feel the rising conflict building, the tension spiraling toward a confrontation that only I could orchestrate. Even as I engaged in polite exchanges, I began mapping opportunities. The hotel, the staff, the family's expectations, all were part of a mental blueprint for the eventual twist. The rising conflict was not a sudden outburst, but a slow burn, escalating through observation, calculation, and preparation. Contrast framed every interaction: their superficial joy versus my inner resolve, their oblivion versus my growing awareness, their celebration versus my plotting. Every detail mattered. Every word became a signal. The psychological stakes intensified when my parents shared digital mementos of the vacation. Photos, videos, even minor anecdotes meant to remind me of my exclusion. The humiliation was palpable, yet within it, I discerned the ingredients for empowerment. Each flash of their assumed dominance provided clues about their vulnerabilities. The rising conflict was fueled not just by emotional tension, but by intellectual strategy. I was learning how to turn invisibility into advantage, humiliation into leverage, exclusion into opportunity. By the end of the week, my plan had begun to take shape. I knew that patience, observation, and subtle maneuvering would be crucial. The family remained blissfully unaware. Each moment of pride, each brag, each casual assumption solidifying the contrast between their confidence and my hidden power. The stage was set, the rising conflict reached its peak intensity, and I could feel the cusp of action drawing near. My next moves would determine how humiliation would transform into triumph, and how subtle observation would convert into a decisive reversal. The days that followed were a torment of invisible knives. Every interaction with my family felt like salt rubbed into old wounds. At brunch, my sister animatedly described snorkeling adventures, the sun casting golden highlights on her hair, her laughter ringing like a bell in a world that seemed to forget I existed. My parents chimed in with exaggerated enthusiasm, reinforcing the narrative that I was, once again, peripheral. Each smile, each story, each casual glance of approval directed solely at my sister sharpened the ache inside me. The contrast between their oblivious joy and my suffocating humiliation was suffocating, nearly unbearable. I felt rage rising alongside a deep sense of helplessness. How could they treat me as if I were a shadow, a ghost at my own family's table? I replayed every past slight, each small humiliation amplified by this latest exclusion. Birthdays where my achievements went unnoticed, holidays where my comfort was secondary, conversations where my thoughts were politely ignored. Every memory came rushing back, a dam of resentment bursting in vivid color. And yet, within this emotional storm, a peculiar clarity emerged. Humiliation had always been a constant in my family life, but now it became fuel. The realization struck me. If I allowed this to continue unchecked, it would define me. I refused to let years of exclusion dictate my worth or my narrative. My emotional breaking point became a crucible, refining my focus and sharpening my resolve. Every insult, every slight, every unacknowledged effort had brought me to this tipping point. I could either succumb to despair, or I could transform my anger into action. The contrast between my private turmoil and their public oblivion became a powerful lens. While they laughed and reveled in the narrative they controlled, I quietly observed, calculating and internalizing every reaction. Their confidence, once intimidating, now seemed brittle. Their assumptions about my passivity, once comforting to them, became the keys to my emerging strategy. In the heat of emotional overload, I recognized patterns they could not see. The breaking point was not just emotional, it was strategic. Small victories began to surface in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. I noticed how staff at events deferred to my decisions when I casually made choices, how acquaintances instinctively followed my lead when I suggested alternatives, and how even my sister sometimes hesitated when confronted with choices she had taken for granted. These micro-assertions reminded me of my latent power. They were breadcrumbs leading to the realization that exclusion did not equal impotence. My hidden capabilities, cultivated over years of quiet observation and restraint, were finally becoming tangible. The emotional storm reached its peak when my sister, in a particularly gleeful moment, mentioned a private dinner they had at the hotel's rooftop terrace, describing every detail with unfiltered joy. My parents laughed, adding anecdotes meant to emphasize their thoughtfulness and her delight. My breath caught as humiliation washed over me once again. And yet, within that same moment, a seed of clarity bloomed. The very pride and overconfidence they displayed were the cracks I would exploit. Their joy, their assumptions, their ignorance. These were not obstacles, but tools. By nightfall, I had made a decision. I would no longer remain a passive observer in my own story. The breaking point had clarified the stakes and the path forward. The humiliation and helplessness had become a crucible, forging a plan built on patience, observation, and subtle leverage. I recognized the emotional weight of my past, the injustices I had endured, and the opportunity that now lay before me. To turn invisibility into prominence, exclusion into empowerment, and humiliation into public acknowledgement. The internal dialogue became a map of strategy. I envisioned scenarios where my parents' and sisters' assumptions about my meekness would backfire spectacularly. Every microaggression, every casual dismissal, every subtle slight had contributed to my preparation. The breaking point was not the end. It was the ignition. I resolved that my next moves would be deliberate, precise, and inevitable. My family's overconfidence, once a source of pain, was now the stage for the reversal I had long dreamed of. I allowed myself a moment of grim satisfaction. The emotional weight of the breaking point had forged clarity from chaos, focus from rage, and purpose from humiliation. The stage was set. I would no longer endure passive exclusion. I would orchestrate visibility, command acknowledgement, and demand respect. The path was clear, and the momentum built from years of observation, humiliation, and latent capability propelled me forward. I was ready to act. The day arrived, one I had been planning in quiet, meticulous detail for years. I stepped into the hotel lobby, not as the forgotten sibling, not as the excluded observer, but as the owner. The sensation was surreal. Every detail, every familiar corner, every staff member's eyes locking onto mine in recognition, not as a guest, but as authority. I had arranged ownership discreetly, building resources and influence while remaining invisible to my family. The contrast between my parents' assumptions and reality could not have been more dramatic. As they walked through the revolving doors, smiles still plastered on their faces from their recent vacation adventures, they were blissfully unaware. My sister, radiant and self-assured as ever, had no inkling of the storm that awaited her. I could see the subtle shift in her posture as hotel staff, trained to acknowledge me with deference, began to guide her to the suite, not as a guest, but as someone under my authority. Their obliviousness, a source of past humiliation for me, had now become the canvas for my dramatic reveal. "Welcome, Ms. Anna," the front desk manager said, her tone formal yet deferential. My parents froze, a flicker of confusion crossing their faces. The pause stretched, heavy with the weight of realization. I smiled faintly, savoring the moment, as the staff continued to address me with respect and attention, signaling the inversion of the family hierarchy they had taken for granted. Their assumptions had been absolute, and now, shattered in a single orchestrated moment, they revealed the vulnerability that I had been observing and cultivating all along. My sister's jaw dropped. "Wait, what?" she whispered, voice trembling, unable to mask the shock. My father stammered, trying to grasp the scene. "But how?" The questions hung in the air, unformed, incapable of bridging the chasm between their expectations and the reality before them. Every word they struggled to form highlighted the contrast framing that had been building for years, their confidence versus my empowerment, their oblivion versus my strategy, their celebration versus my authority. I walked toward them calmly, each step deliberate, exuding the quiet control I had cultivated. "I suppose you didn't realize," I said, voice steady, "that I own this hotel." The statement was simple, yet its impact reverberated like a thunderclap through the lobby. Staff bowed slightly, acknowledging my authority, while my parents' expressions morphed from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror. The humiliation I had endured for years was now mirrored back at them, stark and undeniable. The family's shock was compounded by the staff's respect and attention. Bellhop straightened, concierge personnel addressed me with deference, and every interaction reinforced the sudden inversion of power. My sister's laughter, once uncontainable, faltered and disappeared entirely. The very tools of privilege and indulgence that had humiliated me, the hotel, the attentive staff, the luxurious environment, had been transformed into instruments of revelation and justice. The contrast between their expectations and reality could not have been more pronounced. Dialogue unfolded, sharp and emotionally charged. My mother, voice trembling, asked, "But how could you—" I smiled calmly, allowing the tension to hang. "Years of observation, planning, and patience," I replied. "You assumed invisibility meant weakness. You were wrong." The words landed with precision, cutting through years of assumptions, exposing the family's blind spots, and cementing the dramatic reversal. The hotel, once a symbol of my exclusion, had become the stage for my empowerment. My sister attempted to respond, her usual confidence shaken. I didn't think," she began, but faltered as the staff subtly reinforced my presence. Even the manager glanced toward her, then to me. an unspoken acknowledgement that authority and recognition had shifted. The psychological weight of the moment was overwhelming. Years of favoritism and oversight collapsed under the undeniable reality of my ownership and strategic positioning. The family's sense of superiority, cultivated over decades, had been spectacularly undermined. The revelation was cinematic in its impact. Every glance, every word, every gesture reinforced the inversion. Humiliation now belonged to those who had orchestrated it. Empowerment belonged to me. The staff's natural deference, the subtle but undeniable acknowledgement of authority, and the stunned silence of my family created a tableau of dramatic tension and psychological satisfaction. Contrast framing was at its peak, the powerful now revealed, the complacent humbled, the invisible finally seen. By the end of the evening, the family was in stunned silence. My parents' and sisters' attempts to rationalize, to regain composure, to mask their disbelief, were feeble against the reality of the twist. I walked through the hotel with calm assurance, observing their reactions, savoring the reversal that years of observation, humiliation, and strategic patience had enabled. The secret I had nurtured, hidden in plain sight, had finally manifested, creating the perfect storm of empowerment and psychological triumph. The hotel lobby was unusually quiet, tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break. My parents stood stiffly, their faces pale, eyes darting between me and the staff who now treated me with unmistakable authority. My sister, usually brimming with self-assuredness, clutched her designer bag as if it were a shield. The contrast between my calm composure and their visible panic was intoxicating. For years they had assumed control, wielded favoritism, and dismissed my presence. Now every gesture they had taken for granted was a point of exposure, a marker of the power reversal I had orchestrated. I began slowly, letting the silence stretch. "It seems you weren't aware of who you were dealing with," I said evenly, my voice carrying just enough weight to command attention. The staff nodded respectfully, eyes flicking between me and the family, reinforcing the authority I now embodied. My parents opened their mouths to respond, but no words came. Disbelief had temporarily paralyzed them. Their overconfidence, which had humiliated me for years, was now their undoing. Every subtle remark they had made in my exclusion, every assumption of passivity, was laid bare as folly. My mother attempted to regain composure. We just wanted to give your sister a special experience," she stammered. Her voice cracked under the weight of exposure. "You weren't supposed to take it personally." I inhaled slowly, letting the words sink in, and then met her gaze. "Take it personally? Perhaps. But your intentions no longer matter. You underestimated me. You assumed invisibility equaled weakness. It does not." The calm precision in my delivery contrasted sharply with their panicked energy, every syllable a reminder that the hierarchy they had enforced for years had been dismantled. My father tried a different tactic. "We never meant to." "We thought you were fine with it," he said, desperation seeping through. I shook my head, faintly smiling. "That's exactly the point. You assumed my compliance, my silence, my invisibility. And now, here we are. Your assumptions have consequences." Each word echoed, and every staff member's respectful acknowledgement amplified the public nature of the confrontation. The psychological reversal was complete. Those who had humiliated me were now exposed to the judgment of both myself and the witnesses around them. My sister, eyes wide, whispered, I didn't know." But the sentence faltered. She had always relied on my perceived weakness, my compliance, and my quiet acceptance of exclusion. Now those assumptions crumbled. I leaned in slightly, voice steady but charged. "You enjoyed privileges I was denied, thinking that would never change. But the truth is undeniable. Power, recognition, respect, they are not gifts. They are earned, and sometimes quietly reclaimed." The silence was deafening. Their stammered protests and attempts to rationalize only reinforced the contrast framing. Guests and staff had begun to notice the tension, watching discreetly but with visible curiosity. My calmness, juxtaposed against my family's panic, drew eyes and attention. Every glance, every breath, every subtle gesture magnified the drama. The public element added weight to the confrontation. My parents' and sisters' attempts to maintain dignity were futile in the face of an undeniable reversal, and every micro-expression of guilt, shame, and realization fueled the emotional crescendo. I allowed a pause, letting the gravity of the situation settle. Then slowly, I outlined my terms, not vindictively, but with precise authority. This hotel is under my ownership. Every privilege you assumed for yourself is subject to my discretion, and every slight, every act of exclusion has now been observed and accounted for. The staff's subtle nods and respectful behavior amplified my authority, and the contrast between my composed empowerment and their frantic attempts to reconcile shame with reality was nearly cinematic. By the end of the confrontation, my parents' shock had solidified into recognition. They understood the depth of their miscalculation, the weight of their overconfidence, and the strategic patience I had cultivated over years. My sister, quiet and humbled, finally met my gaze. For once, she saw me, not as the background figure, not as the overlooked sibling, but as an equal and a force to be reckoned with. The climax was complete. The psychological, emotional, and public power reversal had reached its zenith. After the confrontation, the hotel slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the emotional landscape had been irrevocably altered. My parents remained subdued, grappling with the weight of exposure and the consequences of years of favoritism. My sister, humbled yet contemplative, avoided her usual gloating, now aware of the depth of misjudgment that had defined our relationship. The contrast between past humiliation and present empowerment framed every interaction. The previously invisible protagonist now a figure commanding respect, acknowledgement, and authority. I walked through the hotel, interacting with staff and guests, savoring the subtle acknowledgement of authority. Small victories accumulated. Staff deferred to me naturally. Guests greeted me with courteous recognition, and every logistical detail of the hotel reinforced my control. The juxtaposition between my parents' silent reflection and my poised execution of responsibility was stark. Empowerment was not loud or vengeful. It was calm, undeniable, and systemic. Family dynamics subtly shifted in the days that followed. My parents attempted tentative reconciliation, offering explanations, apologies, and gestures of goodwill. I received these with measured acknowledgement, allowing them to confront their own failings without losing my own dignity. My sister, observing my calm authority, began to reconsider past assumptions, her usual self-assurance tempered by awareness. The resolution highlighted not only my regained power, but the ongoing transformation of relational dynamics within the family. Contrast framing continued to drive engagement and tension resolution. The humiliation I had endured over years had been inverted, not through cruelty, but through strategic assertion of hidden capabilities. Past exclusions now served as the narrative of triumph, and my presence, once ignored, became a stabilizing force within the family hierarchy. Each interaction reinforced the theme: power is not given, it is claimed and recognized. Beyond the external validation and reversal, I reflected on my own journey. The patience cultivated during years of subtle humiliation, the observation of family patterns, and the strategic thinking honed in private became evident in how I handled interactions. My empowerment was not reactive, it was proactive, measured, and deliberate. The internal transformation was equally significant. Sitting quietly in the suite I now oversaw, I reflected on the journey from exclusion to empowerment. The sting of humiliation, the sense of invisibility, and the frustration of being underestimated had been catalysts, not barriers. Years of subtle microaggressions, dismissals, and favoritism had sharpened my perception, patience, and strategic thinking. Now, in the aftermath, these experiences were reframed as preparation for the dramatic reversal. Contrast framing was clear: past invisibility versus present authority, exclusion versus recognition, humiliation versus triumph. I considered my parents' reactions. Their shock had given way to tentative acknowledgement and eventually reflection. My sister's pride, tempered by humility, revealed the effectiveness of subtle yet undeniable empowerment. I realized that the emotional journey was not only about vindication, but also about self-worth, boundaries, and the quiet assertion of dignity. Reflection also encompassed internal reconciliation. I acknowledged the complexity of family love, flaws, and human frailty. The empowerment I achieved did not eliminate past pain, but reframed it, turning humiliation into a narrative of strength and strategic patience. Have you ever felt invisible or underestimated? How would you respond if given the opportunity to reclaim your power? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.